Okay, so as I mentioned earlier, the browsers have the ability to create XML documents from scratch. And to do that in Firefox, you call the function document.implementation.createDocument. That's the method that you use in order to create a new document. And you can see the example right here. This is how it's called. It takes a few arguments. First argument is the namespace URL to use. And we're not going to get too deeply into namespaces right now because they're a fairly complex subject, but you should just know that you can pass an empty string for this. The second argument is the name of the root tag that you want to be at the base of the XML document. And again, you can pass an empty string for that, but if you pass a string here, that will become the root tag that's at the base of the document. And the third argument is the document type. And again, this is a bit of an advanced concept. For now, we're just going to use the constant null. And in fact, in most real-world situations, this is what you'll use anyway, so I'm not going to get too deeply into that. And as I mentioned, the namespace URL and sRoot tag can both be empty strings, but typically what you'll want to do is at least pass a tag name as the second argument to save yourself a little bit of typing. Now, once the document has been created, you can use the standard DOM methods to create content. Here's an example of that. This is a complete example in and of itself. You can see at the first line, what we're doing here is we got a variable named XML_doc, and we're calling the createDocument method. And here I'm passing an empty string for the namespace and the word myRoot as the root tag name. And the third argument is null. So once the XML document's been created, we can start making content using the standard DOM methods. So in this example, I'm creating a new paragraph tag using the createElement function. That's going to create this p tag. And then I'm going to create some text to go inside the paragraph. And I do that using the standard DOM createTextNode function. Once I've done that, I append the text into the paragraph, and then I append the paragraph into the document. And if we were to look at this in XML text form, the result would look like this. We'd have myRoot, because that's the root tag that we passed into the createDocument function, and there's our paragraph tag, and this is the string, this is some text. So this is an example of how you can create XML right in Firefox. Now, you can also create an XML document by directly parsing a text string that contains XML code. And in some instances, this may be easier and faster because if you have a small piece of XML code that you need to parse in, this is just a few lines of code. So the way you do this in Firefox is by creating a DOM parser object, and then you call its parseFromString method to parse the data. And we can see an example of that right here. So here I have a variable named oParser. And it's an object reference to this new DOM parser object that I'm creating. And again, this is an example that works in Firefox. We'll cover IE in a bit. Then we have a variable here named XMLDoc. And XMLDoc is being assigned the result of the parser's parseFromString method. So this is another way of creating a document from scratch. You can see here that I'm passing in the XML code in text form. And this is the same text that we had in our previous example. And the second argument to parseFromString is the MIME type that you're going to assign to the content. And for XML, this is going to be applications/XML. Now, the result of this will be an XML document, just like we saw in the previous example. The only difference here is that we're creating it from a string rather than using the DOM methods to create the tags. We're not done yet, however. There's other ways to get hold of XML documents. You can load XML content from a URL, and this can either be from the network or from the local file system, which is useful when you're building your application and debugging it. And the way that you do this is by using the load method. And XML content can be loaded either synchronously or asynchronously, and we'll look at both examples. So the example here, I have a variable named XMLDoc, and I'm creating it using the createDocument method like I did earlier on. In this case, however, I'm going to load it synchronously. Now, the default is to load documents asynchronously, so you have to explicitly set the async property on the document object to false if you want to load things in a synchronous fashion. So once I've done that, I call the XMLDocs load function, and I pass in the URL that I want to load things from. Now, I can just give it a file name, and it will load it from the same directory that this page came from, or I can give it an HTTP address, and it will load from that address as well, subject to all the security restrictions that your browser has. Okay, you can also, as I mentioned, load from a URL asynchronously. And what that means is when you call the load function is going to go off and start loading the document, but it's going to return immediately so your script can continue executing. And when the document is finished loading an event will be fired by the browser, and you can use that event to call a function that needs to be called when the document finishes loading. In this example, I've got my same document, and I've created it up here using document.implementation.createDocument, and I'm passing in root and a null value. And then I set the async flag here to be true. Now, when I do that, I need to do things a little bit differently. I need to set the onload event handler for the document to be a function that's going to be called when the document finishes loading. In this case, I've set it to be a function named docLoaded, and I'm passing in the XML doc as an argument to that function. So now, when I call the load function, the browser is going to go ahead and go off and start loading the document, but any JavaScript statements I have following the load statement here are just going to keep right on executing. So you shouldn't execute any statements that depend on the document being loaded until your asynchronous event handler has been called. And that's this function right here. So in this case, docLoaded will be fired when the document has finished loading. Now that we've seen how to work with XML in Firefox, it's time to look at some real-life examples.